In the autumn of 1991, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a young woman went missing without warning just weeks before her wedding. Police found no evidence, and the case quickly went cold, leaving investigators with absolutely no answers. Nearly 3 decades passed with hope fading into mere memory. But years later, one small detail hidden in plain sight reopened the case. What the family ultimately discovered exposed a truth no one was prepared for. Before we begin, please like this video and subscribe to the channel to help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Now, let's get into today's missing person case. Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in the early 90s, was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, left their doors unlocked, and found comfort in the predictable rhythm of daily life. The town was framed by rolling farmlands and historic brick buildings. It was a community built on trust, and right in the heart of that community lived 24-year-old Valerie Hayes. Valerie was a third-grade teacher at a local elementary school, and she was the kind of person who seemed to radiate a quiet, effortless warmth. She had a gentle voice, a patient smile, and a natural ability to make everyone around her feel safe. Parents requested her for their children. Her colleagues adored her. To anyone looking in from the outside, Valerie's life was entirely picture-perfect. She was especially close to her older sister, Lorraine, and their mother, Evelyn. The three of them had been an unbreakable trio ever since Valerie's father passed away when she was just a little girl. They spent their weekends together, sharing Sunday dinners, drinking coffee on Evelyn's front porch, and talking for hours about everything and nothing. Lorraine, who was 4 years older, had always been fiercely protective of Valerie. She saw her younger sister as someone pure, someone who deserved the absolute best the world had to offer. And for a long time, it seemed like Valerie had found exactly that. 2 years prior, at a community summer barbecue, Valerie was introduced to Brendan Croft. Brendan was 27, charismatic, sharply dressed, and worked as a branch manager at a prominent local credit union. He was outgoing where Valerie was quiet, and he seemed to sweep her entirely off her feet. He brought her flowers at the school where she taught. He took her on weekend trips to the coast. He charmed Evelyn and won over Lorraine with his easy laugh and polite manners. When Brendan proposed to Valerie on a snowy December evening in front of both of their families, everyone cheered. It felt like the beginning of a beautiful chapter. The wedding was set for the first weekend of November in 1991. By October, the preparations were in full swing. The invitations had been mailed out, the flowers were ordered, and the church was fully booked. Evelyn had spent a significant portion of her modest savings to help pay for the reception, wanting her youngest daughter to have the day of her dreams. Valerie's dress, a stunning ivory gown with delicate lace sleeves, was hanging safely in the guest bedroom of Lorraine's house, waiting for the final alterations. Everything was moving forward perfectly. But as the weeks closed in on the wedding date, Lorraine began to notice a subtle, unsettling shift in her sister. It did not happen all at once. It was a slow, creeping change that was incredibly easy to dismiss at first. Valerie started losing weight. The bright, genuine smile that she always wore seemed to fade, replaced by a tight, forced expression. She started canceling casual lunch plans with Lorraine, claiming she was overwhelmed with grading papers or finalizing seating charts for the reception. When they did spend time together, Valerie was unusually quiet. She seemed distant, often staring out the window, lost in thought. Lorraine assumed it was just pre-wedding jitters. Everyone knew that planning a large wedding was stressful, and Valerie was naturally a bit of a perfectionist. But looking back, there were moments that went far beyond normal stress. There were times when the phone would ring at Evelyn's house, and Valerie would physically flinch. If she answered and heard Brendan's voice on the other end, her posture would stiffen, and she would carry the corded phone into the hallway, lowering her voice to a hurried whisper. If you're enjoying this story so far, please subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more real missing person cases. About 10 days before she vanished, Valerie and Lorraine went to a local diner for breakfast. It was a crisp Saturday morning. Lorraine tried to keep the conversation light, talking about the bridesmaid dresses and the catering menu, but Valerie was completely checked out. She was pushing her eggs around her plate, her eyes constantly darting toward the diner entrance every time the bell above the door chimed. Lorraine finally reached across the table, placed her hand over Valerie, and asked her point-blank if she was okay. She asked if she was getting cold feet. Valerie looked at her sister for a long time. Her eyes were rimmed with red and she looked utterly exhausted. Instead of answering the question, she asked one of her own. She asked in a very soft, shaking voice if anything ever happened, would Lorraine promise to look after their mother. Lorraine nervously laughed it off, telling Valerie she was being ridiculous and dramatic over wedding stress. Valerie forced a smile, nodded, and changed the subject. That conversation would haunt Lorraine for the rest of her life. The morning of Saturday, October 12, 1991, started like any normal weekend. The air was brisk, and the trees lining the streets of Lancaster were shedding their autumn leaves. Lorraine and Valerie had a strict schedule that day. They were supposed to meet at exactly 10 in the morning at a bridal boutique downtown for Valerie's final dress fitting. Evelyn was going to meet them there with a vintage veil she had worn at her own wedding. Lorraine arrived at the boutique at 9:45. She browsed the racks, chatting with the owner, waiting for her sister to walk through the door. By 10:15, there was no sign of Valerie. Lorraine wasn't initially worried. Traffic could be slow or Valerie might have been running late getting ready. But as the clock on the boutique wall ticked toward 10:30, a strange knot began to form in Lorraine's stomach. Valerie was a teacher. She was deeply, unfailingly punctual. It was completely out of character for her to be this late without calling. At 10:45, Evelyn arrived at the shop, holding a white garment bag. When she saw Lorraine sitting alone in the waiting area, her face dropped. Lorraine found a payphone in the back of the boutique and dialed Valerie's apartment. The phone rang and rang, echoing endlessly into the receiver. There was no answering machine, just the continuous, hollow sound of ringing. Trying to remain calm, Lorraine called the credit union where Brendan sometimes went on Saturday mornings to catch up on paperwork. The receptionist put her through. Brendan answered, sounding relaxed. When Lorraine asked if Valerie was with him, he seemed surprised. He told Lorraine that he had left their apartment around 8 in the morning to play a round of golf with his friends. He said that when he walked out the door, Valerie was sitting at the kitchen table in her bathrobe, drinking a cup of coffee and reading the morning paper. He assured Lorraine that she was probably just caught up with a neighbor or had lost track of time. But Lorraine knew her sister. Valerie would never lose track of time on the day of her final fitting. Leaving Evelyn at the boutique just in case Valerie showed up, Lorraine drove across town to the apartment Valerie shared with Brendan. The drive took less than 15 minutes, but to Lorraine, it felt like hours. She pulled onto their quiet residential street. The neighborhood was completely still. Leaves were blowing across the pavement. Valerie's sensible blue sedan was parked right in the driveway, exactly where it always was. Lorraine walked up to the front porch and knocked on the door. She waited. She knocked harder, calling out her sister's name. The only response was the sound of the wind rustling the large oak tree in the front yard. A terrible, heavy silence hung over the property. Lorraine reached into her purse, retrieved the spare key Valerie had given her months ago, and slid it into the deadbolt. With a loud click, the door unlocked, and Lorraine pushed it open. The apartment was perfectly neat. It was almost too neat. The living room cushions were perfectly arranged. The television was off. Lorraine called out for Valerie again, her voice echoing slightly in the small space. She walked into the kitchen. Sitting on the small wooden table was a ceramic mug, exactly as Brendan had described. Lorraine touched the side of it. The coffee inside was completely cold. Sitting next to the mug was the morning newspaper, neatly folded. Lorraine's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She walked down the short hallway into the bedroom. The bed was made. Valerie's purse was hanging on the back of the bedroom door. Lorraine unzipped it. Valerie's wallet, her driver's license, her checkbook, and her car keys were all sitting right inside. She hadn't taken a single thing with her. Panic fully setting in, Lorraine walked back out to the kitchen, unsure of what to do next. That was when something on the kitchen counter caught her eye. It was something small, resting in the exact center of a white paper napkin. Lorraine slowly walked over to the counter. Sitting there, catching the morning light filtering through the blinds, was Valerie's diamond engagement ring. It hadn't been dropped or tossed aside. It had been carefully and deliberately placed there. A cold sweat broke out on the back of Lorraine's neck. She spun around, frantically scanning the room, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. If Valerie had simply gotten cold feet and left, why would she leave her car, her money, and her identification? How far could she possibly go? As Lorraine backed away from the counter, she noticed a draft of cold air hitting her ankles. She turned toward the back of the house. The hallway led to a small mudroom and a back door that opened into a narrow alleyway behind the property. The back door was ajar. It was wide open, swinging very slightly on its hinges as the crisp autumn wind blew in. Lorraine walked toward it, her breath catching in her throat. She pushed the door open completely, stepping into the mudroom. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no broken glass. But as she looked down at the pale linoleum floor just inside the threshold, her blood ran completely cold. There, stamped clearly against the clean floor, was a single, large, muddy footprint. It was a heavy boot print with deep, aggressive treads. It was far too large to belong to Valerie, and it was pointed inward, stepping into the house. If you love true mystery stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. We're getting closer to our first 1,000 subscribers. Lorraine stood completely frozen in the narrow mudroom, her eyes locked on the floor. Her mind refused to process what she was seeing. It was a heavy, dark mud print of a large boot, pressed clearly against the pale linoleum. It was pointed directly into the house, a silent and terrifying indicator that someone else had been there. Someone who did not belong. The crisp autumn breeze continued to push through the open back door, carrying the scent of damp leaves and cold earth, but Lorraine could barely breathe. A wave of profound terror washed over her. Something was terribly wrong. This was no longer a case of cold feet. This was a nightmare unfolding in real time. Her hands trembled so violently that she could barely hold her purse as she backed away from the mudroom. She ran to the kitchen wall phone, snatched the receiver from its cradle, and dialed for help. Her voice cracked as she spoke to the emergency dispatcher, struggling to articulate the bizarre scene. She explained the cold coffee, the abandoned purse, the engagement ring placed perfectly on a napkin, and the terrifying footprint by the open door. The dispatcher told her to step outside immediately and wait by her car. Lorraine ran out the front door, gasping for air, her eyes scanning the quiet, seemingly peaceful street. Everything looked entirely normal, which somehow made the situation feel even more horrifying. Within 10 minutes, the piercing wail of sirens shattered the quiet Saturday morning in Lancaster. 2 squad cars pulled up to the curb, followed shortly by an unmarked sedan. Detective Arthur Vance stepped out of the vehicle. He was a seasoned investigator in his late 50s, a man who had seen decades of crime in a town that usually felt immune to it. He had a calm, commanding presence. He immediately ordered his officers to secure the perimeter of the house and carefully tape off the back alleyway. As the police began their work, another car came speeding down the street. It was Evelyn. She had grown too anxious waiting at the bridal boutique and had driven over to see what was taking so long. When she saw the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the windows of her daughter's apartment, she practically fell out of her car. Lorraine ran to her mother, pulling her into a tight embrace on the front lawn. Evelyn collapsed against her oldest daughter, sobbing uncontrollably. The devastating reality of the scene was too much to bear. Her beautiful, careful, gentle daughter was gone, and the police tape surrounding the house felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread. A few moments later, Brendan's car tore around the corner, tires screeching as he pulled into the driveway behind Valerie's sedan. He leaped out, still wearing his golf clothes, his face pale and contorted with panic. He rushed toward the house but was quickly intercepted by uniformed officers. He demanded to know what was happening, his voice echoing down the street. Detective Vance stepped in, pulling Brendan aside to speak with him calmly. Lorraine watched them from a distance, her protective instincts flaring. She studied Brendan's face. He looked genuinely terrified. He kept running his hands through his hair, packing back and forth, shaking his head as the detective asked him questions. Vance walked Brendan through his morning timeline step by step. Brendan repeated exactly what he had told Lorraine on the phone. He said he woke up early, got dressed, and left the house at 8 in the morning for his tea time. He swore that Valerie was sitting right at the kitchen table, drinking her coffee, reading the morning paper, and wearing her pink bathrobe. He said the back door was absolutely locked when he left. He never left it open, and Valerie was incredibly safety conscious. When Vance asked about the engagement ring left on the counter, Brendan looked completely devastated. He said they hadn't argued. He claimed everything was absolutely perfect between them, and they were both incredibly excited for the wedding. The police forensics team worked meticulously inside the apartment, but the reality of criminal investigation in 1991 was incredibly frustrating. There were no cell phones to track. There were no security cameras on the neighboring houses. DNA testing was in its absolute infancy and not readily available for standard missing person cases. They carefully took a plaster cast of the muddy footprint in the mudroom. It was a size 11 steel-toe work boot, heavily worn on the outer heel. It was the kind of boot worn by thousands of construction workers, mechanics, and laborers across Pennsylvania. It was a solid clue, but it was far too generic to point to a specific suspect. They dusted the back door for fingerprints but found nothing useful. The doorknob had been wiped entirely clean. That single detail sent a chill down Detective Vance's spine. A door swinging open in the wind might be an accident, but a wiped doorknob meant someone had taken deliberate steps to hide their presence. Someone had entered that house intentionally. But why was there no sign of a struggle? Nothing in the house was broken. The furniture was untouched. If a large man wearing heavy work boots had broken in and taken Valerie by force, she would have fought back. She would have screamed. But the neighbors reported hearing absolutely nothing. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe if you haven't already. It helps us keep sharing real cold case stories every week. The investigation quickly fanned out across the community. The Lancaster police organized massive search efforts. Hundreds of volunteers, including parents of the children Valerie taught, showed up to comb through the nearby woods, the local parks, and the banks of the Susquehanna River. They handed out thousands of missing person flyers with Valerie's smiling face printed in stark black and white ink. The community was entirely heartbroken and mobilized, desperate to bring their favorite teacher home. Detective Vance and his team dug into Brendan's life, treating the fiancé as the most obvious suspect. It was standard procedure. They interviewed his coworkers at the credit union, his friends, and his family. They verified his alibi for that morning with intense scrutiny. It turned out to be completely airtight. 3 separate men confirmed that Brendan arrived at the golf course just after 8:30 in the morning. They played a full 18 holes and never left each other's sight until Lorraine called the clubhouse searching for Valerie. Unless Brendan had hired someone to take his fiancée, he simply could not have been the person who left that muddy footprint. And financially, Brendan was in deep debt. He barely had enough money to cover his share of the rent, let alone hire a professional. The police looked into Valerie's past, searching for disgruntled ex-boyfriends, angry parents from her school, or anyone who might hold a grudge. They found absolutely nothing. Valerie was universally loved. She had no enemies, no secret bank accounts, and no history of erratic behavior. The case was entirely baffling. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the thin autumn air, leaving behind only a cold cup of coffee, a diamond ring, and a single, terrifying footprint. The days dragged into weeks, and the emotional toll on the family became unbearable. The first weekend of November finally arrived. It was the weekend Valerie was supposed to be married. Instead of walking down the aisle in her beautiful ivory gown, the church doors remained closed. The reception hall was silent. Lorraine spent the entire weekend sitting on the floor of her mother's living room, holding Evelyn as she wept until she had no tears left. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. The joyous anticipation of a wedding had been cruelly replaced by a suffocating, endless nightmare of not knowing. As winter set in and snow began to blanket the streets of Lancaster, the police presence slowly dwindled. The daily phone calls from Detective Vance turned into weekly check-ins, and then eventually into monthly updates that offered no new information. The search parties disbanded. The missing person flyers taped to telephone poles began to fade and tear in the harsh winter winds. The police were forced to admit that they had hit a massive brick wall. Without a body, without a witness, and without a viable suspect, the investigation ground to a painful halt. The case was officially growing cold. Brendan packed up his belongings and moved out of the apartment by January. He told Lorraine he simply couldn't handle the memories anymore. He moved to a different city entirely, trying to start over. Lorraine didn't blame him. She knew that living in the space where the woman you loved had been stolen away would drive anyone completely insane. But Lorraine refused to give up. She refused to let her sister become just another forgotten file in a dusty police cabinet. When the lease on Valerie's apartment finally ended in late February, Lorraine took it upon herself to clear out the remaining items that Brendan had left behind. Mostly, it was Valerie's clothes, her books, and her childhood keepsakes. Lorraine spent 3 days working in the freezing, empty apartment, packing boxes and fighting back tears. On the final afternoon, Lorraine was clearing out the top shelf of Valerie's bedroom closet. She reached toward the very back, feeling around in the dark corners to make sure nothing was left behind. Her fingers brushed against something hard and wooden, shoved entirely out of sight behind a stack of old winter blankets. She pulled it out into the light. It was a small, intricately carved cedar box. It was a jewelry box that their father had given Valerie when she was a little girl. Lorraine recognized it immediately, but she hadn't seen it in years. She sat down on the bare bedroom floor and tried to lift the lid. It was firmly locked. Something about the weight of the box and the deliberate way it had been hidden away from Brendan's view made Lorraine's heart race. She went to the kitchen, grabbed a flathead screwdriver from an abandoned tool drawer, and returned to the bedroom. With shaking hands, she wedged the metal tip under the tiny brass lock and pried it upward. The old wood splintered with a sharp crack, and the lid popped open. Lorraine slowly lifted the lid, unsure of what she was about to find. The box did not contain jewelry. It was entirely empty, except for 2 items resting at the bottom. The first was a folded piece of thick, yellowed paper. Lorraine opened it. It was an official receipt from a specialized photo restoration laboratory located in Philadelphia, nearly 2 hours away from Lancaster. The receipt was dated October 9, 1991. That was exactly 3 days before Valerie vanished. The service requested on the receipt was for the chemical extraction and enhancement of an old, damaged negative. Lorraine's brow furrowed in deep confusion. Valerie had never mentioned traveling to Philadelphia that week, let alone visiting a specialized photo lab. And why would a third-grade teacher need a high-level chemical enhancement of an old negative? But it was the second item in the box that caused the blood to drain entirely from Lorraine's face. It was a small, rectangular piece of lined notebook paper. Written on it, in Valerie's unmistakable, neat handwriting, was a message. The ink was pressed deeply into the paper, showing how hard she had been bearing down on the pen when she wrote it. The note was short, but it carried a terrifying weight. It read, "The original is hidden where we used to play. If he finds out what is in the background, I am dead." Lorraine stared at the paper, her hands trembling so fiercely she nearly dropped it. A cold wave of shock washed over her, followed immediately by a burning sense of clarity. Valerie hadn't just been stressed about the wedding. She had been terrified. She had discovered something. She had found a photograph, an old image that contained a secret so dangerous she believed it could cost her her life. And whoever she was running from, whoever she was trying to hide the truth from, had found her first. The muddy footprint in the mudroom suddenly took on a much darker, much more sinister meaning. It hadn't been a random break-in. It was someone looking for the photograph. Lorraine looked down at the horrifying note again, "Where we used to play." Lorraine knew exactly where that was. It was a place she hadn't been to in almost 15 years. But if her sister had hidden something there, she was going to find it. And for the first time in months, the dead-end case had just burst entirely back to life. Lorraine barely registered the freezing February wind hitting her face as she ran to her car. She clutched the handwritten note so tightly that her fingernails dug painfully into her palm. She knew exactly where Valerie had hidden the original photograph. When they were little girls, their grandparents had owned a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Lancaster, right near the edge of a dense, sprawling forest. At the property line stood a massive, ancient oak tree that had been hollowed out by a lightning strike decades earlier. It was their secret hiding place. They used to hide small toys, diaries, and little treasures inside the dark cavity of the trunk. The farmhouse had been sold to another family a few years after their grandparents passed away, but the tree had always remained. Lorraine drove recklessly, her tires slipping on patches of black ice as she navigated the winding rural roads. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She finally had a real lead. She finally had something tangible. She pulled up to the edge of the old property, throwing the car into park before it had even fully stopped. She ran across the snow-covered grass, her eyes desperately scanning the tree line for the familiar, towering branches of the old oak. But as she reached the edge of the woods, Lorraine froze. Her breath plumed in the freezing air, and her knees suddenly felt weak. The tree was gone. Where the massive oak had stood for over a century, there was now nothing but a jagged, snow-covered stump. The ground around it had been torn up by heavy machinery. Lorraine dropped to her knees in the snow, frantically digging around the base of the stump with her bare hands, searching for the hollow cavity. The wood was solid and dead. A man walked out from the farmhouse, zipping up his winter coat, and asked her what she was doing. With tears streaming down her face, Lorraine begged him to tell her what happened to the tree. The man looked sympathetic but shook his head. He explained that the oak had started rotting from the inside out and became a hazard to the power lines. He had hired a crew to chop it down and run the wood through an industrial wood chipper just before Thanksgiving. The debris had been hauled off to a commercial landfill months ago. Lorraine collapsed into the snow, sobbing until her lungs burned. The one piece of evidence that could have explained her sister's disappearance was gone forever, ground into sawdust and buried under tons of garbage. She had hit an absolute, immovable dead end. Time is a cruel and relentless force. It does not stop for grief, and it does not pause for unanswered questions. The months slowly bled into years, and the years quietly stretched into decades. The mystery of Valerie Hayes became a local legend in Lancaster, a sad story whispered by the older residents whenever a new family moved into the neighborhood. But for Lorraine and her mother, the nightmare never ended. It simply became a permanent, heavy fixture in their daily lives. As the calendar turned from the 90s into the 2000s, life moved forward for everyone else. Brendan eventually relocated to Ohio, married a woman there, and had 3 children. He rarely called, slowly fatting into a ghost from a past life. Detective Arthur Vance, the lead investigator who had promised to find Valerie, eventually retired. His hair turned snow-white, and he traded his badge for a fishing rod, though he quietly kept a copy of Valerie's case file in the bottom drawer of his home office desk. He never forgot the girl who vanished, leaving only a single muddy footprint. The heaviest toll fell on Evelyn. The stress and heartbreak of losing her youngest daughter aged her terribly. In the winter of 2010, almost 19 years after Valerie vanished, Evelyn suffered a severe stroke. Lorraine spent weeks sitting by her mother's hospital bed, holding her fragile hand. On the night Evelyn passed away, she looked up at Lorraine with tear-filled eyes and asked if Valerie was waiting for her. Lorraine wept and promised her mother that she would never stop looking for the truth. When Evelyn died, Lorraine was completely alone, but she kept the small cedar box, the photo lab receipt, and Valerie's terrifying handwritten note displayed prominently on her bedroom dresser. They were her daily reminders. 27 years passed. It was now May of 2018. Lorraine was now in her late 50s, her own hair streaked with silver. She still lived in Lancaster, working as a middle school principal. She had long accepted that Valerie was dead, but the burning need to know how and why had never faded. She just never expected the answer to come on a random Tuesday afternoon. Lorraine was sitting at her desk at the school when her cell phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed the main number for the Lancaster Police Department. She answered cautiously. On the other end was Detective David Miller, a young, sharp investigator who ran the cold case division. He sounded tense. He asked Lorraine if she could come down to the station immediately. He told her that a construction crew working on a property just outside of town had unearthed something she needed to see. When Lorraine arrived at the police precinct, her stomach was tied in knots. She was escorted into a sterile, brightly lit conference room. Sitting at the table was Detective Miller. Next to him, looking older and deeply weathered, was retired Detective Arthur Vance. Miller had called him in out of respect for his years of work on the case. Sitting in the exact center of the long metal table was a small, heavily rusted tea tin. It was caked in dry dirt and oxidized metal. Lorraine sat down slowly, her eyes locked on the tin. Detective Miller explained that the current owners of her grandparents' old farmhouse had decided to install a large in-ground swimming pool in their backyard. The excavation crew had to dig deep into the earth, ripping out the remaining, stubborn root system of the old oak tree that had been cut down in 1991. Tangled deep within a massive cluster of roots, buried nearly 3 feet underground, the excavator bucket had scraped against metal. Miller put on a pair of blue latex gloves and gently lifted the lid of the rusted tin. Inside, perfectly protected from the moisture and the earth, was a heavy, thick plastic storage bag. He slid the bag across the table. Written on the outside of the plastic in faded black permanent marker was the name Valerie Hayes. Lorraine gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. After 27 years, her sister's voice was finally reaching out from the dark. Miller opened the plastic bag carefully. Inside were 2 items. The first was a small, dark strip of standard 35mm film negative. The second was a glossy 4x6 color photograph. It had been preserved in absolute perfection. Miller placed the photograph on the table and gently pushed it toward Lorraine. Lorraine leaned in, her hands trembling so fiercely she had to grip the edges of the table to steady herself. She braced herself to see something horrifying. She expected a picture of a murder or a violent crime or something deeply disturbing. But when her eyes focused on the image, she was instantly hit with a wave of profound confusion. It was an old family photograph. Judging by the faded colors and the clothing, it was taken in the summer of 1974. Lorraine was about 11 years old in the picture, and Valerie was just a little girl, holding a red balloon. They were standing in front of the local community lake, smiling brightly at the camera. Standing right behind them, with his hands resting proudly on their shoulders, was their father. He was a tall, handsome man who had died in a car accident just a few years after that picture was taken. It was a beautiful, entirely wholesome, nostalgic memory. There was absolutely nothing sinister about it. Lorraine looked up at the detectives, tears pooling in her eyes. She told them she didn't understand. She explained the note she had found in the cedar box decades ago. She recited the words from memory. "If he finds out what is in the background, I am dead." Retired Detective Vance leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses. He picked up the photograph by the edges. He studied the foreground, then slowly shifted his gaze to the background behind the family. Because the camera lens had been focused on the girls and their father, the background of the image was heavily blurred. It showed the grassy hill rolling down toward the lake, a crowded picnic pavilion, and a line of cars parked along the edge of a dirt road in the distance. It was a busy scene, completely out of focus, just a wash of muted colors and soft shapes. Vance looked at Lorraine with a sudden flash of realization in his old eyes. He pointed to the lab receipt sitting in the case file. He explained that in 1991, Valerie had taken the original negative to a high-end laboratory in Philadelphia to have it chemically enhanced. She was trying to pull out the details hidden in that blurry background, but the technology of 1991 was limited. It was slow, expensive, and relied on dangerous chemical baths that took days to process. She had hidden the original picture and the negative in the tree to keep it safe, but someone had figured out what she was trying to do before she could retrieve the enhanced copy. Detective Miller carefully picked up the strip of negative with a pair of plastic tweezers. He looked at Lorraine and Vance, his voice dropping to a serious, heavy tone. He told them that the technology of 1991 might not have been able to expose the truth quickly enough to save Valerie, but the digital forensic technology of 2018 could do it in a matter of hours. The next 3 days were pure agony for Lorraine. She barely slept. She paced the floors of her house, her mind racing with 1,000 terrifying possibilities. What could a 7-year-old girl have accidentally captured in the background of a family photo that was worth killing over 17 years later? On Thursday morning, Detective Miller called. He told Lorraine to come directly to the Pennsylvania State Police Forensic Laboratory in the city. When she arrived, Vance was already there, packing the hallway with a tense, unreadable expression on his face. They were ushered into a dark, quiet room dominated by a massive, high-definition computer monitor. A senior forensic technician sat at the keyboard. The technician explained that he had scanned the original film negative using an industrial-grade drum scanner, capturing the image at an incredibly massive resolution. He had then run the raw data through advanced digital sharpening software, using artificial intelligence to rebuild the blurred pixels and pull the background into sharp, undeniable focus. Lorraine stood behind his chair, her breath catching in her throat as the original blurry photograph appeared on the massive screen. The technician moved his mouse, drawing a square around the top right corner of the image, far behind the smiling faces of Lorraine, Valerie, and their father. The area highlighted was the dirt road near the edge of the woods, far away from the busy picnic pavilion. "I'm going to apply the enhancement filters now," the technician said quietly. He clicked a button on his keyboard. The screen blinked. The wash of blurry colors shifted, snapped, and locked into crystal-clear focus. Lorraine gasped so loudly it echoed in the small room. She grabbed the back of the technician's chair, her legs suddenly giving out as a cold, paralyzing shock hit her system. Standing half-hidden in the tree line, clearly watching the picnic, was a man. He was leaning against the tailgate of a very specific, heavily customized two-tone pickup truck. The man was holding something in his hands, staring directly at the back of Lorraine's father. Lorraine didn't just recognize the truck. She recognized the man's face. The details were undeniable. The heavy brow, the distinct jawline, the cold, flat stare. It was a face she had trusted her entire life. It was a man who had sat in her mother's living room, drinking tea and offering comfort while they wept over Valerie's disappearance. It was a man who had been right there in the apartment the very morning Valerie vanished. The heavy brow, the distinct jawline, the cold, flat stare. It was unmistakable. The man standing half-hidden in the tree line in the photograph was Arthur Vance. The very same Arthur Vance who was currently standing not 5 feet away from her in the darkened forensic laboratory. The hum of the massive computer server in the corner of the room suddenly sounded like a roaring freight train in Lorraine's ears. The air in the room felt impossibly thin. Her blood turned to ice, and her legs began to shake so violently she had to lean her entire body weight against the back of the technician's chair just to stay standing. She slowly turned her head. The cold, blue glow of the massive high-definition monitor illuminated the room, casting deep shadows across the faces of the men standing behind her. Detective Miller was staring at the screen with intense curiosity, completely oblivious to the earth-shattering reality of the image. But Arthur Vance was not oblivious. The retired detective was staring directly at the enhanced photograph. His eyes were wide, and the color had completely drained from his weathered face. His jaw was locked tight. He was looking at his younger self, captured forever in a moment he thought he had completely erased from the world. For a fraction of a second, in the dim light of the laboratory, Vance shifted his eyes away from the monitor and looked directly at Lorraine. It was a look of pure, predatory calculation. "Lorraine," Detective Miller said gently, breaking the suffocating silence, "take a close look at the screen. Do you recognize the man by the truck? Do you know who this is?" Lorraine's mind screamed at her to point a finger at Vance, to yell for Miller to arrest him right then and there. But a primal, deeply ingrained survival instinct clamped down hard on her throat. She was trapped in a dark, soundproof room with a man who had murdered her sister, a man who had a badge, a gun, and decades of experience covering his tracks. If she accused him now, with only a digital image as proof, he would find a way to twist the narrative. He was a master manipulator. He had controlled the entire investigation for decades. She needed more than just a blurry face on a screen. She needed the absolute truth. Lorraine forced her breathing to slow down. She looked back at the screen, blinked heavily, and shook her head. "No," she lied, her voice barely a whisper. "No, I don't know who that is. It caught me off guard to see someone spying on my father. I feel sick. I think I need to get some air." Miller immediately stepped forward, offering a supportive hand, but Lorraine backed away. She didn't look at Vance as she walked toward the door. She pushed her way out of the laboratory, hurried down the brightly lit hallway, and practically ran to her car in the parking lot. Once she was safely inside her vehicle with the doors locked, the adrenaline crashed. She gripped the steering wheel and broke down into violent, shaking sobs. The betrayal was so massive it felt difficult to comprehend. It all made terrifying, perfect sense. The heavy size 11 steel-toe work boot in the mudroom wasn't a random clue left behind by a careless burglar. It was standard-issue footwear for local law enforcement in the early 90s. The wiped doorknob wasn't the work of an amateur. It was the deliberate action of a seasoned police officer trained in forensic evidence. The reason the investigation hit an immediate brick wall, the reason the search parties always seemed to check the wrong areas, the reason the case went cold so quickly, was because the man leading the search was the man who took her. Arthur Vance had sat in their living room. He had drank tea with her mother. He had held Evelyn's hand while she wept, promising her that he would not rest until he found Valerie. He had watched their family completely fall apart, knowing exactly where Valerie's body was the entire time. It was a level of pure, unadulterated evil that Lorraine could barely process. But a massive, glaring question remained. Why? What could possibly connect the murder of a 24-year-old school teacher in 1991 to a photograph taken at a family picnic in 1974? The answer was standing right in front of the man in the picture. The answer was their father. Lorraine wiped her tears, shoved her keys into the ignition, and drove completely out of the city. She didn't go home. She knew Vance would likely watch her house. Instead, she drove to the Lancaster County Public Library. It was a massive, multi-story brick building that housed decades of local newspaper archives and public records. She went straight to the basement level, where the old microfiche machines were kept in quiet, dusty rows. She pulled the reels from November of 1977. That was the year her father, Robert Hayes, had died. Her mother had always told her it was a tragic late-night car accident on a rainy road. Lorraine threaded the thin strip of film into the machine and turned on the backlight. She scrolled rapidly through the weeks, the glowing green screen flashing with old advertisements and local news, until she found the headline from a Tuesday morning edition. Local county auditor dies in tragic auto accident. Lorraine leaned in, reading the faded print. The article detailed how her father's car had skidded off a steep embankment along the Susquehanna River, crashing into the rocky water below. But it was the second paragraph that made her breath catch. The article mentioned that Robert Hayes had been in the middle of a massive, highly sensitive internal audit of the Lancaster Police Department's civil forfeiture funds. Millions of dollars in seized cash had mysteriously vanished over a 5-year period. Robert had been scheduled to present his final findings to a federal judge just 2 days after his car went off the cliff. Lorraine scrolled to the end of the article, searching for the name of the responding officer who had officially ruled the crash a simple, weather-related accident. There it was, printed in stark black letters: Officer Arthur Vance. The hidden connections locked together like pieces of a terrifying puzzle. Her father hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered to protect a corrupt ring of police officers who were stealing massive amounts of money. Vance was the man assigned to silence him. That was why Vance was watching him at the lake in 1974. He was stalking him, learning his routine, planning the assassination. And little 7-year-old Valerie, playing with a camera she barely understood, had accidentally captured the stalker in the background of a family memory. 17 years later, Valerie was preparing for her wedding. She was likely going through old boxes of photos to make a display board for the reception. She must have noticed the strange man lurking behind their father. She took the negative to a lab in Philadelphia to get a clearer look. And while she was waiting for the results, she must have crossed paths with Arthur Vance in town. Maybe he came into the credit union where Brendan worked. Maybe she saw him at the grocery store. However it happened, Valerie recognized his face. She realized the friendly local detective was the man who had been stalking her father just before he died. She hid the photo lab receipt in the cedar box. She wrote the desperate note. She knew her life was in danger, but Vance was a cop. He had access to phone records. He had a network of informants. He realized Valerie was looking into the past, and he moved fast. He broke into the apartment on the morning of October 12th, left the muddy footprint, wiped the doorknob, and erased the only person who could connect him to the stolen money and a 17-year-old murder. Lorraine sat back in the library chair, the glowing green light reflecting in her terrified eyes. She had the motive. She had the entire story, but she still did not have hard, physical proof. A jury would need more than a theory built on an old photograph and a newspaper article. She needed physical evidence linking Vance to Valerie's disappearance. She closed her eyes, forcing her mind back to the days following the disappearance. She remembered sitting in her mother's living room, listening to Detective Vance talk. He used to tell long, rambling stories to try and calm Evelyn down. He often talked about his private life, portraying himself as a simple, hardworking man. Lorraine remembered a specific conversation. Vance had bragged about a large piece of property he had purchased for cheap in the late 70s. It was a remote, wooded lot in the Appalachian foothills of neighboring Lebanon County. He said it was his private sanctuary, a place where no one ever bothered him. He even joked that a man could disappear up there and nobody would ever find him. At the time, it sounded like harmless small talk. Now, it sounded like a confession. Lorraine left the library and drove to the county clerk's office just before it closed. She requested the property tax records for Arthur Vance. The clerk handed her a printed sheet of paper. There it was, an 80-acre plot of deep forest land located at the end of a dead-end dirt road in Lebanon County. By the time Lorraine got back to her car, the sun had fully set. Dark, heavy storm clouds were rolling across the Pennsylvania sky, bringing a cold, punishing rain. It was the kind of night that kept everyone indoors. It was the perfect cover. She drove out of Lancaster, the windshield wipers slapping a frantic rhythm against the glass. The further she drove into Lebanon County, the more isolated the world became. The streetlights vanished, replaced by towering walls of dark pine trees that seemed to press in on the narrow, winding road. After nearly an hour of driving, her headlights caught a rusted metal gate blocking a dirt driveway. A faded "No Trespassing" sign hung by a single chain. This was the property. Lorraine pulled her car off the main road, hiding it behind a thick cluster of evergreen bushes. She grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from her glove compartment and stepped out into the freezing rain. The darkness was absolute, heavy and suffocating. She climbed over the rusted gate and began the long walk up the muddy driveway, the rain soaking through her coat. After half a mile, the trees cleared, revealing a small, dilapidated hunting cabin. But it wasn't the cabin that caught Lorraine's attention. Sitting about 50 yards behind the cabin, half swallowed by overgrown weeds and dead vines, was a large, sagging wooden barn. Lorraine walked toward the barn, her boots sinking into the thick mud. The wooden double doors were chained shut, secured by a heavy brass padlock, but the wood around the lock was completely rotted. Lorraine picked up a large, heavy stone from the ground and smashed it against the rusted metal chain. After 3 massive blows, the rotten wood splintered, and the chain gave way. She pulled the heavy door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing into the dark woods. Lorraine stepped inside, clicking on her flashlight. The air inside the barn was thick with the smell of old motor oil, dust, and decay. She swept the beam of light across the dirt floor. Sitting in the very center of the barn, covered by a massive, heavy canvas tarp, was the shape of a vehicle. With shaking hands, Lorraine grabbed the corner of the dusty canvas and pulled it back. Her breath caught in her throat. Sitting exactly as it had been parked decades ago, covered in a thick layer of dust but perfectly preserved, was the two-tone pickup truck from the photograph. The truck Vance had leaned against at the lake. Lorraine walked around to the driver's side. The door was unlocked. She pulled it open, the hinges screaming in the quiet barn. She shined her light over the cracked leather bench seat, the rusted steering wheel, and the cluttered floorboards. She reached across the seat and popped open the metal glove compartment. Inside the small compartment was a plastic grocery bag, tied tightly at the top. Lorraine's heart hammered a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She pulled the bag out, her hands shaking so violently she could barely untie the knot. She pulled the plastic apart and shined her flashlight inside. Lying at the bottom of the bag was a long, soft strip of fabric. It was completely unmistakable. It was the cloth tie sash from a pale pink bathrobe. The exact same pink bathrobe Valerie had been wearing the morning she vanished. The edges of the fabric were heavily stained with old, dark, dried blood. Lorraine dropped the bag onto the seat, backing away from the truck as a wave of absolute horror washed over her. She finally had it. She had the physical proof. She had the murder weapon, the timeline, and the physical link. She turned to run out of the barn and called Detective Miller. But as she spun around, a blinding white light flooded through the cracks in the barn walls. The heavy crunch of thick tires rolling over the gravel driveway echoed through the storm. A vehicle had just pulled up to the barn, blocking the only exit. The engine shut off. The heavy, metallic thud of a truck door closing pierced the sound of the rain. And then, slow, deliberate footsteps began walking toward the open barn doors. The silhouette of a man appeared in the open doorway of the barn, backlit by the headlights of his vehicle. The freezing rain poured down behind him, framing his wide shoulders and thick build. He stood perfectly still for a moment, listening to the heavy, panicked breathing echoing from the dark corners of the barn. Then Arthur Vance reached into his heavy winter coat and pulled out a dark steel revolver. Lorraine backed away slowly, her boots shuffling against the dirt floor. She clicked off her flashlight, plunging her section of the barn into absolute darkness, hopping to blend into the shadows of the old truck. Her heart was beating so fiercely it physically hurt her chest. The air smelled of rust, damp earth, and impending death. "You always were the stubborn one, Lorraine," Vance's voice called out over the sound of the rain. His tone was chillingly calm, completely devoid of any panic or urgency. It was the voice of a man who had spent his entire life in absolute control. "Your mother was soft. Valerie was naive. But you just couldn't let it go, could you?" Vance took a slow step into the barn, the heavy crunch of his boots sounding exactly like the muddy footprint left on Valerie's kitchen floor 27 years ago. He reached over to a wooden post near the door and flipped a heavy electrical switch. A row of dim, yellowed overhead bulbs flickered to life, bathing the center of the barn in a sickly, pale light. Lorraine was trapped against the side of the truck, the bloody pink sash still sitting on the cracked leather seat beside her. There was nowhere to run. The only exit was blocked by the man who had destroyed her family. "I saw your face in the laboratory today," Vance said, walking slowly toward her, keeping the gun leveled directly at her chest. "You looked at that screen and you knew. I have to admit, I was impressed you kept your mouth shut in front of Miller. But when you ran out of there, I knew exactly where you were going. You went looking for the history, and then you came looking for the proof." Lorraine's hands shook violently, but a sudden, burning anger began to push through her absolute terror. She gripped the heavy metal flashlight like a weapon. She looked at the old man, her eyes filled with decades of built-up grief and rage. "You killed her," Lorraine's voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "You killed my father, and then you murdered my little sister just to cover it up." Vance stopped about 10 feet away from her. He looked down at the plastic bag resting on the seat of the truck, and a slight, cold smile crossed his weathered face. "Your father was a problem," Vance said casually, as if he were discussing a minor inconvenience rather than a human life. "He was digging into police funds. He was going to expose a lot of good men who were just taking what they deserved. He had to be stopped. It was nothing personal, Lorraine. It was just the job." He shifted his weight, his eyes darkening as he thought back to 1991. "But Valerie was a tragedy. I never wanted to hurt that girl. I sat in your living room. I drank tea with your mother. I genuinely liked your family. But a few days before she disappeared, I walked into the local diner to grab a cup of coffee. Valerie was sitting in a booth. She looked up at me, and all the color drained from her face. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated terror. That was when I knew she remembered. She remembered the man watching her father at the lake." Lorraine felt sick to her stomach. She pictured her sister, terrified and alone, realizing that the friendly local detective was a monster. "I couldn't let her talk to anyone," Vance continued, his voice dropping lower. "So, on the morning of October 12th, I waited for her fiancé to leave for his golf game. I walked up to the front door and knocked. She opened it right away. Why wouldn't she? I was a decorated police detective. But the moment I stepped inside, she knew why I was there. She tried to run for the back door." Tears streamed down Lorraine's face, mixing with the cold rain on her cheeks. She could see it happening in her mind, a nightmare finally coming into sharp, devastating focus. "I caught her in the kitchen," Vance said coldly. "I grabbed the sash of that pink bathrobe. It was over in 2 minutes. She didn't even have time to scream. I carried her out the back door and put her in my trunk. I took the engagement ring off her finger and left it on the counter to make it look like she got cold feet and ran away. I wiped the doorknob. The only mistake I made was stepping in that mud on my way out. But it didn't matter. I was assigned to lead the investigation. I controlled the evidence. I controlled the search parties. I steered everyone exactly where I wanted them to go." Vance raised the revolver, aiming it directly at Lorraine's head. His expression was completely empty. "It's a shame, Lorraine. I really am sorry it has to end this way. But you understand I can't let you leave this barn." Lorraine squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the gunshot. She gripped the flashlight, ready to throw it and fight with her dying breath. Suddenly, a massive, blinding spotlight pierced through the cracks in the wooden barn walls, washing the entire interior in brilliant white light. A second later, the deafening shriek of multiple police sirens shattered the quiet night. Red and blue strobes flashed violently against the wet trees outside. Vance froze, his eyes going wide with shock. He spun toward the open barn doors just as a heavy, amplified voice boomed over a police megaphone. "Arthur Vance, drop the weapon immediately. Step out of the barn with your hands raised. You are completely surrounded." It was Detective David Miller. Vance stood completely paralyzed. The absolute control he had maintained for nearly 30 years vanished in a single second. He looked at the gun in his hand, then looked out at the heavily armed state troopers swarming his driveway, their weapons raised and trained directly on the barn doors. He realized with absolute certainty that it was entirely over. There was no talking his way out of this. There was no evidence left to hide. Vance slowly lowered the revolver. He dropped it onto the dirt floor. He raised his hands in the air and walked slowly out into the freezing rain. Lorraine collapsed against the side of the rusted pickup truck, her legs completely giving out. She slid down to the dirt floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The barn was suddenly filled with uniformed officers. Detective Miller rushed inside, kneeling beside Lorraine and wrapping a thick thermal blanket around her trembling shoulders. Miller explained that he hadn't believed her for a second when she claimed not to recognize the man in the photograph at the laboratory. He had seen the absolute terror in her eyes. The moment she left, Miller pulled the old case files and dug into Vance's original police reports from 1991. He found the missing connections to her father's death in the 1970s. Fearing for her safety, Miller had pinged Lorraine's cell phone location and coordinated a massive state police response, rushing to the Lebanon County property just in time. The next morning, the storm cleared, leaving behind a cold, bright autumn day. The secluded property was swarming with forensic teams, evidence technicians, and heavy machinery. Yellow police tape surrounded the old barn and stretched deep into the woods behind the cabin. Lorraine stood at the edge of the tree line, a hot cup of coffee trembling in her hands, watching the investigators work. Detective Miller stood quietly beside her. Just before noon, a forensic anthropologist working in a shallow depression about 100 yards behind the barn gently brushed away a layer of dark soil. He stopped, stood up, and signaled to the rest of the team. They had found her. Wrapped in a heavily degraded plastic tarp, buried deep beneath the roots of the overgrown weeds, were the skeletal remains of Valerie Hayes. When Miller gently delivered the news, Lorraine completely broke down. It was a massive, overwhelming wave of emotion. It was the agonizing heartbreak of finally confirming her sister was truly gone, mixed with the profound, exhausting relief of finally knowing the truth. The 27-year nightmare was over. Valerie was no longer a lost girl in the woods. She was finally going home. The arrest of Arthur Vance sent absolute shockwaves through the town of Lancaster and the entire state of Pennsylvania. The story dominated the national news for months. The respected, retired detective was exposed as a cold-blooded killer who had used his badge to hide a massive web of corruption and murder. During the extensive interrogation, faced with the bloody bathrobe sash and the forensic evidence from the burial site, Vance finally confessed to everything. He detailed the theft of the police funds, the murder of Robert Hayes in 1977, and the tragic, desperate murder of Valerie in 1991. Because of his age and the overwhelming amount of evidence, Vance pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in a maximum security state penitentiary, guaranteeing he would die behind bars, stripped of his pension, his freedom, and his false legacy. The state also launched a massive posthumous investigation into the other officers involved in the 1970s corruption ring, finally clearing Robert Hayes's name and restoring honor to his memory. 2 weeks before Christmas, on a quiet, snowy morning, Lorraine stood in the local Lancaster cemetery. The entire community had shown up to pay their respects. Former students, old neighbors, and retired teachers stood shoulder to shoulder in the cold air. Valerie's beautiful mahogany casket was gently lowered into the earth, placed directly next to the graves of her father and her mother, Evelyn. Lorraine stepped forward, holding the small, intricately carved cedar box that she had found in the back of the closet so many years ago. She placed it gently on top of the casket. Inside the box was the original family photograph from the lake, finally restored to its innocent meaning. It was a picture of a father and his 2 little girls, smiling in the summer sun, completely untouched by the darkness that would follow. As the snow began to fall over the quiet cemetery, Lorraine felt a profound sense of peace wash over her for the first time in almost 3 decades. She had kept her promise to her mother. She had never stopped looking. She had walked into the absolute darkest corners of her family's past, and she had dragged the truth out into the light. The tragic story of Valerie Hayes became a permanent part of the town's history, but it was no longer a story about a missing girl. It was a story about the unbreakable bond of family. It was a testament to the fact that no matter how deep a secret is buried, no matter how much power and authority stands in the way, the truth has a permanent pulse. It waits patiently in the dark, in the background of old photographs, in the forgotten corners of dusty barns, and in the relentless hearts of the people left behind. Love is a fierce and stubborn force. It does not forget, and it does not surrender. And in the end, it was a sister's unwavering love that finally brought Valerie Hayes out of the shadows and brought a monster to justice.